A peaceful night on the way home from a family gathering suddenly turns into a nightmare for Jacob Carter when he's stopped by prejudiced police officers. Despite doing nothing wrong, Jacob is ordered out of the car and quickly thrust into a dangerous situation, all while they remain unaware that he is an FBI agent. What will happen when the shocking truth is revealed? To find out how the story unfolds, hit the subscribe button and stay tuned. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Jacob Turner, an experienced FBI agent, sat relaxed behind the wheel as his car glided down the empty road late at night. The soft hum of the engine and the steady rhythm of the tires on the pavement became the soundtrack to his drive. Above, the stars twinkled, as if congratulating him after a warm evening spent with family. Jacob had just left his cousin's birthday party. It was a small, simple gathering with his loved ones, making him feel a deep sense of happiness from the laughter, good food, and the warmth of family. Time seemed to slow down, allowing Jacob to relax and forget the daily pressures of his work. These moments reminded him that, after all, he was still a man who loved his family and cherished every peaceful second. Jacob glanced down at the dashboard. 11:47 p.m. He was just a few miles from home. All he wanted now was to get home, take off the formal suit he had worn all day, and sink into his soft couch. But even in this moment of relaxation, a vague sense of unease unexpectedly rose within him. For Jacob, this feeling was not new. As a black man, even being an FBI agent hadn't shielded him from experiences of discrimination. Past experiences had taught him that the badge didn't always protect him from the ingrained prejudices of society. Sometimes, in the eyes of certain people, especially officers with a bias, he wasn't seen as a law enforcement official to be respected, but as a suspicious black man. Jacob sighed, shaking his head slightly to push the negative thoughts away. He didn't want to think about it, not now. However, a small voice in his mind kept reminding him, one wrong encounter with a stranger at night can change everything. He knew this bitter truth all too well. The justice system he served had also been the same place where he'd encountered injustice. Jacob had been pulled over more times than he could remember, and each time, his hope for fairness faded a little more. The yellow streetlights cast a soft glow on Jacob's calm face as he drove through a quiet neighborhood, the houses lying still in the shadows. Suddenly, that uneasy feeling intensified, as if warning him of something to come. And before long, the flashing red and blue lights of a police car appeared behind him, shattering the quiet night. Jacob's heart sank as a familiar wave of frustration and weariness washed over him. Here we go again, he thought as his eyes met the flashing lights reflected in the rearview mirror. Though he had gone through this before, he could never fully adjust to the unfairness he might face. He quickly checked his speed. Everything was fine. He wasn't speeding, his lights weren't out, and there was no sign of careless driving. There's no reason for this, he told himself. But deep down, Jacob knew the reason all too well. He sighed again, keeping his hands steady on the wheel, just as his father had taught him long ago. Keep your hands where they can see them. Be respectful and cooperate. Just make it home safely. That's all that matters. His father's advice echoed in his mind, reminding him that no matter who he was or what his status, when faced with prejudice, it all came down to the color of his skin. Jacob pulled over to the side of the road, staring at the police lights flashing behind him, mentally preparing for whatever might come next. Though he was trained to handle tense situations, to stay calm and resolve conflicts, at this moment, all those skills seemed to fade into the background. It's time, Jacob muttered to himself, as the red and blue lights danced in the rearview mirror, illuminating the quiet night sky. He kept his hands on the wheel, glancing quickly at the rearview mirror, as he saw two officers slowly step out of the patrol car. They approached his vehicle with the confidence of people who were sure they were about to find something illegal. The first officer, Nathan Ellis, walked up to Jacob's window. Ellis was a middle-aged man with sharp features and a cold stare. From the way he adjusted his belt and placed his hand near his gun, Jacob could tell this wasn't just a routine check. The second officer, Tom Scott, a younger man, stood on the other side of the car, looking cautious, as if waiting for instructions from his partner. Jacob closed his eyes for a second, taking a deep breath to stay calm. When Ellis reached the window, Jacob pressed the button to roll it down. The beam of Ellis's flashlight shone directly into Jacob's eyes, blinding him momentarily. License and registration. Ellis commanded, his voice cold and authoritative, with no trace of friendliness. Jacob nodded slowly, making sure his movements were deliberate and clear to avoid any misunderstandings. He opened his wallet and took out his driver's license, then reached for the registration papers from the glove compartment. "Here you go, officer," Jacob replied, keeping his voice steady, even though his heart was beating faster. "Is there a reason I was pulled over?" Ellis didn't answer right away. Instead, he just stared at Jacob, then glanced at his nice car. "This your car?" Ellis asked, his tone laced with suspicion and sarcasm, as if a black man driving a nice car was unacceptable. Jacob suppressed the irritation rising within him. This wasn't the first time he'd faced such baseless suspicion. "Yes, this is my car," he answered calmly, handing over his paperwork without changing his demeanor. Ellis looked at the license and registration, but it was clear he wasn't really interested in the details. His eyes quickly flicked back to Jacob, as if searching for something that wasn't there. "Where are you coming from this late?" Ellis asked, his tone accusatory, as though driving home late at night was inherently suspicious. Jacob took a deep breath, trying to keep his voice calm. "I'm coming from a family birthday party." Ellis frowned, a mocking smile spreading across his face. "Birthday, huh? Why so late?" He peered into Jacob's car, as if looking for something to incriminate him. Despite finding nothing, Ellis maintained his air of suspicion, his voice full of groundless accusation. "Yes, a birthday," Jacob responded, feeling the frustration building but still keeping his calm. "I don't see a problem with that." The officer on the other side, Scott, tapped lightly on the passenger window. Jacob turned to him and pressed the button to lower it. "Can I help you with something?" Jacob asked, still maintaining a professional tone, though the tension was starting to rise inside him. But before Scott could say anything, Ellis cut in with a blunt command. "Step out of the car." Jacob looked up, surprised by the sudden escalation. "Officer, I've complied with everything you've asked. I'd like to understand the reason for this." Ellis wasn't interested in explanations. "I said step out of the car." His voice was sharp and threatening, his hand hovering near his gun. Jacob could feel the tension in the air. This was exactly the kind of situation he had feared, a situation that could escalate too quickly and end in tragedy. With his skills and experience as an FBI agent, Jacob knew that even the smallest resistance could be seen as justification for violence. Slowly, he opened the car door, stepped out, and stood with his hands raised slightly in front of him, making it clear that he posed no threat. But this didn't calm Ellis. In fact, he and Scott seemed even more on edge, their cold eyes fixed on Jacob as though they were waiting for a reason to act. Ellis stepped closer, his gaze provocative. "You carrying any weapons?" he asked, his voice filled with suspicion and accusation. Jacob remained calm, knowing that any word or gesture could be misinterpreted. "No, officer, I don't have any weapons. I'm an FBI agent, and my ID is in the glove compartment." But Ellis wasn't interested in Jacob's explanation. "FBI, huh? That's a new one. I've heard all kinds of stories. But you think just saying that gets you off the hook?" He laughed, turning to Scott with a smirk. "You hear that, Scott? This guy says he's FBI." Scott, while less enthusiastic, stood silently with a look of doubt, his hand resting close to his weapon. Jacob could see a bit of confusion in Scott's eyes, but it was clear he wasn't about to question his partner. Jacob sensed the tension in the air rising, like a taut string about to snap. He had faced many tense situations in his career, but this one felt dangerously out of control. Ellis wasn't looking to resolve the situation peacefully. Instead, he seemed determined to push it to the brink. "I've complied with all your requests," Jacob said, his voice still calm, though a wave of anxiety was building inside him. "If you want to check my FBI badge, it's in the glove compartment." Ellis sneered, stepping even closer to Jacob, shortening the distance between them. "I don't care about your so-called FBI badge," he said with disdain. "You think that badge means you get out of this? I'm the one in charge here." Jacob felt his heart rate increase. He realized that Ellis wasn't just trying to assert his authority, he was deliberately trying to intimidate him. Although Jacob didn't want to escalate the situation, he also knew he couldn't let Ellis continue behaving unreasonably without some form of resistance. Jacob's eyes flicked to Scott, who still stood silently by, showing no intention of intervening. Ellis stood so close to Jacob that he could smell the strong scent of coffee on the officer's breath. "Pop the trunk," Ellis ordered, his voice hard. "I want to see what you're hiding in there." Jacob frowned. "Officer, I don't think that's necessary. There's nothing illegal in my car." But before Jacob could finish his sentence, Ellis suddenly grabbed his arm and shoved him against the car, slamming his body into the edge of the vehicle. His shirt was pulled tight and ripped open at the shoulder, exposing his bare chest. Jacob felt a sharp pain from the impact, but he didn't dare resist forcefully. He knew all too well that any resistance could lead to something far worse. "Trying to be smart, huh? Or you think I don't have the right to search this car?" Ellis shouted, his voice sharp, clearly losing control. Scott stood off to the side, eyes filled with confusion. He wasn't participating in the violence, but he also wasn't stopping it, as though he feared Ellis more than the situation unfolding before him. Scott's silence only made the situation more tense. Jacob understood that this silence was part of the problem. Scott wasn't stopping it, allowing the situation to spiral out of control, simply because he was too afraid to challenge his colleague. Jacob tried to remain calm, breathing deeply but steadily. "I'm not resisting. I just want everything to go by the book," he said, his voice low but firm. However, Ellis wasn't listening. He turned back to Jacob's car and started rummaging through it. The feeling of helplessness overwhelmed Jacob as he watched. Even though he knew he hadn't done anything wrong, the threat of violence and abuse of power loomed over him, leaving him no way out. This wasn't just about the car or the paperwork. This was about his dignity being openly violated. As Ellis continued rifling through the car, an unsettling thought crossed Jacob's mind. This situation was escalating beyond his control. Things could go in an unpredictable and dangerous direction, and he wasn't just worried about his belongings. He was worried about his life. Jacob stood still on the roadside, feeling the cold air bite at his skin where his shirt had torn, exposing his chest and stomach. The chill of the night began to seep into his bones, but the burning frustration and fear within him were more intense than ever. Jacob knew that this escalation wasn't going to stop here, and with Ellis pushing the situation further, seemed only a matter of time. "What now, Agent?" Ellis emphasized the word mockingly, his eyes flashing with menace. "You think you can give me orders? This isn't your playground." Jacob took a deep breath, trying to remain calm, but his body tensed with a sense of impending danger. He knew all too well the type of man Ellis was, the kind who only needed the slightest excuse to turn a situation into a disaster. Even though he had done nothing wrong, Jacob knew that to someone like Ellis, his very existence was already a crime. "I'm not giving you orders," Jacob said, his voice steady, though his eyes never left Ellis's. "I just want things to be done by the book, with no wrongdoing." But Jacob's words only seemed to infuriate Ellis further. He sneered, turning to Scott and shouting, "You hear that? This guy thinks he can dodge responsibility because he's FBI." Then turning back to Jacob, Ellis's voice dripped with malice. "No FBI is saving you tonight." Jacob realized that this situation had gone far beyond a routine stop. Ellis wasn't just suspicious of him, he was deliberately pushing things to a new level, seeking to turn this into a violent encounter to justify his actions. Ellis stepped closer, just a few feet away from Jacob now, making the tension between them even more palpable. "I gave you a chance to prove yourself, but now it's over," Ellis said, his hand hovering near his gun as though preparing for a confrontation. "I'm going to find out the truth myself." Jacob knew this situation was teetering on the edge of something dangerous. He had been in many tense situations throughout his career, but never had it been with a police officer in control. He decided not to respond to Ellis's provocation, knowing that any reaction could lead to disaster. Scott, standing nearby, finally spoke up, but his voice was weak and almost lost in the cold air. "Dan, that's enough. He's complied with everything. We haven't found anything. Let's check his badge and let him go." But Ellis ignored him. "Shut up, Scott," he snapped. "You're not in charge here." Ellis's eyes flashed with anger as he glared at Scott, as if his colleague's attempt to intervene was a personal betrayal. Scott lowered his head, avoiding Ellis's gaze. He clearly didn't want to challenge his partner, but Jacob could see the inner struggle in his eyes. Scott knew that what was happening was wrong, But the fear of Ellis's authority kept him trapped in silence. Ellis turned back to Jacob, his eyes full of threat. "Step behind the car," he ordered, his voice brimming with authority. "I'm going to search you from head to toe to see what you're hiding." Jacob hesitated for a moment. He knew that any resistance could make things worse. But standing on the side of the road, shirt torn and being body searched in the middle of the night, felt like the ultimate insult. He had followed all the rules, and now all he was getting in return was humiliation and degradation. "I have nothing to hide," Jacob said, his voice calm but firm. "I've cooperated with you from the beginning. If you need more, my FBI badge is in the car. You can check it yourself." Ellis shot Jacob a cold look before suddenly stepping forward and shoving him forcefully against the car again, this time with much more force. The sharp pain shot through Jacob's back and shoulders as the hard metal of the car slammed into his spine. Ellis's eyes gleamed with satisfaction, as if he had been waiting for this moment. Just then a thought flashed through Jacob's mind, a realization that if this situation continued to spiral, things could become uncontrollable. Ellis's aggression, combined with Scott's silent complicity, could turn this into a nightmare that Jacob wouldn't wake up from. Ellis abruptly turned to Scott and ordered, "Hold him steady. I'm going to search the car more thoroughly." Scott stood still, looking between Jacob and Ellis, clearly torn between following orders and doing the right thing. But in the end, he couldn't overcome his fear of his partner. Scott moved closer to Jacob, his hand resting on his shoulder in a half-hearted attempt to comply with the command. Jacob looked at Scott with a gaze full of helplessness, but without hatred. He didn't blame the man for facing this difficult choice, but Scott's silence was what was driving this dangerous situation deeper. As Ellis continued to ransack Jacob's car, searching for some reason to justify his actions, Jacob could only stand there, feeling the cold night air and the humiliation of being treated like a nameless criminal, even though he was the one sworn to uphold the law. Jacob knew this situation had already spiraled out of control, and something worse could be on the horizon. As Ellis continued to tear through his car with increasing violence, Jacob stood by Scott, trapped between feelings of humiliation and rising tension. With few options left, he had to maintain his calm, even as everything around him escalated unpredictably. Scott's grip on Jacob's shoulder remained, though it was loose, almost reluctant. Jacob turned his head, catching Scott's gaze. For a fleeting moment, Jacob saw a flicker of regret in Scott's eyes, as if he wanted to say something, to stop things before they went too far. But Scott said nothing. He remained silent, his hand on Jacob's shoulder in a gesture of forced compliance, though his conscience was clearly uneasy. Ellis, finding nothing in the car, grew impatient. His anger seemed to burn inside him. He pulled out harmless items from the trunk, papers, a few personal belongings, but the emptiness didn't quell his rage. Ellis wasn't just looking for a reason to search. He wanted to assert his power, no matter the cost. "There's nothing here," Ellis muttered, but his voice was filled with frustration. Then in a sudden and senseless move, he turned to face Jacob, striding toward him with a face full of aggression. "You think you're smart, hiding things so well, but you're not fooling me?" Ellis yelled. Jacob could feel the tension in the air thickening, and before he could react, Ellis grabbed the torn fabric of Jacob's shirt, yanking it hard and tearing the last piece away. Jacob now stood shirtless in the cold night air, exposed on the street. The act of tearing his shirt wasn't just an attack on his dignity, it was a blatant display of power and oppression. "I told you, I have nothing to hide," Jacob replied, his voice still incredibly calm despite the storm of anger building inside him. He knew he couldn't afford to lose control, not now. Ellis ignored Jacob's words. He turned to Scott, his tone dripping with mockery. "You see this, Scott? These guys always have something to hide. They think they're clever, trying to outsmart us." Ellis laughed darkly, his smile full of hidden hatred. Scott didn't smile. He stood there watching the scene before him with an uncomfortable expression. "Dan, that's enough," Scott whispered, his voice trembling. "He's got nothing. There's no reason to keep going." Ellis spun around, his face flushed with anger. "Shut up, Scott! Who do you think you are to stop me?" Ellis yelled, his voice shattering the stillness of the deserted street. Jacob could clearly see the conflict brewing inside Scott, a young officer filled with contradictions. He was torn between doing the right thing and following the orders of his aggressive colleague. Scott locked eyes with Jacob for a moment, and in that instant, Jacob realized Scott was afraid, not just of Ellis, but of what they were doing. As Ellis continued to raise his voice, Jacob sensed that violence was looming. Ellis had crossed the line of control and was pushing the situation into dangerous territory. Jacob knew he had to act quickly before things spiraled out of control. But how? He couldn't fight back with violence. It would only make the situation worse. At that moment, a car passed by and slowed down, its headlights illuminating the road. Jacob realized the presence of a third party might be the only hope to stop Ellis's madness. Ellis turned his head toward the car, glaring at it angrily, as if the interruption had robbed him of his chance to unleash his fury. "Get out of here!" Ellis screamed at the car, but it didn't stop. However, its presence was enough to make Ellis pause, even if just for a second. Jacob seized the brief moment to take a deep breath, trying to calm himself. He knew he had to find a way out of this without making things worse. "Officer, I've been cooperative from the start. If you want to check, call someone with authority. I just want to make sure we're following proper procedure." Ellis turned back, his eyes flashing with anger, but also a hint of hesitation. Jacob's mention of authority seemed to make him wary. Despite holding power, Ellis didn't want to let things escalate to the point of attracting attention from his superiors or anyone else. Meanwhile, Scott stood beside Jacob, looking visibly confused and scared. He couldn't look Jacob in the eye anymore. "Dan, call for backup. We don't need to push this any further," Scott said, his voice pleading. Ellis took a deep breath, then turned his back to Jacob, as if trying to contain his anger. He stood still for a moment, fists clenched, then growled at Scott. "Fine, call them." Scott quickly pulled out his phone and called for backup from the station. Meanwhile, Jacob remained still, feeling the tension ease slightly, but he knew it wasn't over. To Ellis, this power struggle was never just about this moment. After turning his back on Jacob, Ellis took a few steps to calm down, but the anger still burned in his eyes. He wasn't one to easily give up when he felt his authority was being challenged. Scott's hesitation only fueled his rage further, as if his colleague's quiet resistance was shaking his control. "Fine, let's see who comes to settle this," Ellis said, his voice dripping with contempt. He turned back to face Jacob, his eyes full of hatred. "But don't think this will end smoothly. I'll find something." Jacob took a deep breath, trying to remain calm. Every second felt as tense as the ticking of a clock. He knew the backup might take a few minutes to arrive, but with Ellis, a single moment of lost control could turn everything into a disaster. Ellis's gaze remained locked on Jacob, like a predator eyeing its prey, unwilling to let go of the opportunity. Ellis approached Jacob again, this time not tearing his clothes or shoving him, but staring straight into his eyes, his gaze filled with years of pent-up rage. "You think you're something, don't you? An FBI agent? But tonight, you're just a black guy standing in the street with no one to help you." Jacob heard every word Ellis spat at him, each one cutting into his pride like a knife, but he couldn't react. Every word Ellis said was designed to provoke, a reaction Jacob knew would only make the situation worse. Standing there, exposed under the night sky, Jacob felt like a target for Ellis's hatred and prejudice. But before Jacob could say anything, Scott suddenly spoke up, his voice shaky but determined. "Dan, stop," Scott said, his eyes shifting from Jacob to Ellis. "He's been cooperative from the beginning. We have no reason to continue this." Ellis whipped around, his eyes blazing with fury. "You're taking his side, Scott? Do you even know what's happening here? This isn't about cooperation. It's about power," Ellis practically roared, his voice echoing in the stillness of the night. Jacob remained silent, sensing that the confrontation between Ellis and Scott was nearing a boiling point. Both men were locked in a power struggle, one driven by Ellis's violence and authoritarianism, the other by Scott's growing disillusionment with his colleague's actions. Scott stood his ground, though his face was pale with tension. "We're cops, Dan. We're supposed to serve justice, not use it to satisfy our anger or ego." Scott's voice grew stronger. He had decided that this had to end, and he could no longer stay silent. Ellis stood still for a moment, his face like stone, his eyes dark. Scott's words had clearly struck a nerve. In that moment, Jacob realized that things could go one of two ways. Either Ellis would back down and let this end, or his fury would explode, sending everything into chaos. Then, the thing Jacob feared most happened. Ellis suddenly lunged at Jacob, completely losing control. He grabbed Jacob's throat and slammed him against the car again, this time with much more force. Jacob felt pain shoot through his body as his back hit the metal. The sound of the impact ringing in the air, and the faint scent of blood filled his nose. Scott screamed, "Stop, Dan! You've gone too far!" But Ellis didn't hear him anymore. He was lost in his rage, intent on punishing Jacob for no clear reason. Ellis's eyes were wild and all his strength was focused on overpowering Jacob. Jacob felt his body weakening, but he couldn't let himself give in. Though he refused to fight back physically, he used every ounce of strength left to stay balanced, not letting Ellis completely dominate him. In the distance, the sound of police sirens grew louder, signaling that help was on the way. But would it arrive in time to prevent a catastrophe? Jacob wasn't sure. Ellis's anger had crossed every boundary, and he seemed determined not to stop until Jacob was completely defeated, physically and mentally. Scott, no longer able to hold back, shoved Ellis off Jacob. "You have to stop! You're going to kill him!" Scott yelled, his voice a mix of fear and regret. Ellis froze, breathing heavily, his bloodshot eyes glaring at Scott. The two stood facing each other, and for a brief moment, no one knew what would happen next. Jacob gasped for air, trying to stand upright, knowing that the time to end this conflict was running out. The sirens continued to wail, getting closer. Ellis seemed to realize this too. He loosened his grip, looking around, then slowly backed away, as if struggling between continuing or stopping before the situation became irreversible. Even though Ellis stepped back, the tension in the air didn't ease. Jacob still felt the pain from the hard impact against the car, but now the physical pain seemed less significant compared to the overwhelming need to stay mentally strong. Despite being attacked, despite almost being crushed by Ellis's unjust power, Jacob knew he couldn't collapse now. The truth needed to come to light. "Dan, what are you doing?" Scott practically screamed, panic clear in his voice. He stepped forward, standing between Ellis and Jacob, as if trying to prevent any further action from his colleague. Scott's eyes were filled with guilt and unease, and he glanced at Jacob with genuine concern. "We have to stop, Dan," Scott continued, his voice trembling as if he were walking on a thin wire. "We've gone too far." Ellis took a deep breath, his shoulders tense as if ready to explode. He was no longer the rational officer, but a man driven by wounded pride and hatred. "Too far?" Ellis spun on Scott, his eyes blazing. "Can't you see? We're in control here. He's just a liar, and if you're not with me, you're no different from him." Scott flinched, stepping back a little under Ellis's fiery gaze. It was clear he had reached his limit, but the fear of Ellis still held him back from taking stronger action. In that moment, Jacob understood that everything now depended not on Ellis's decisions, but on Scott's. His safety hinged on whether Scott would dare to stand up against this senseless violence or continue to submit to his colleague's authority. Jacob, struggling to breathe normally, looked directly into Scott's eyes. "Scott," he said, his voice calm but resolute, "you know this is wrong. You can stop this before it gets worse. I don't want anything more than to end this the right way." Scott looked at Jacob, the internal struggle evident in his eyes. Jacob's words seemed to awaken something in him. Scott took a deep breath, then turned to Ellis, his voice still shaking, but now with a resolve that hadn't been there before. "Dan, this has to stop. You can't keep doing this," Scott said, and this time his eyes didn't avoid Ellis's gaze. "If you don't stop, I'll report the whole thing." Ellis glared at Scott, his face turning red with fury. "Are you crazy, Scott? You're turning your back on me for him?" Ellis practically shouted, each word like a punch into the air. But this time, Scott didn't back down. "It's not for him, Dan. It's for what's right. We're police officers, and we have to do the right thing." In that moment, it seemed Ellis realized his control was slipping. Beads of sweat appeared on his forehead, and in Ellis's eyes, Jacob saw confusion, panic, and even fear behind the mask of rage. Ellis knew that Scott, though his colleague, was no longer on his side. The truth, no matter how much Ellis tried to deny it, was surfacing. And then, in a fit of rage, Ellis did the thing Jacob had feared from the start. With a shocking speed, Ellis pulled out his gun and pointed it directly at Jacob. "You're not getting away with this," Ellis said, his voice full of madness. Scott frantically lunged forward, but Ellis shoved him aside. "Stop! You don't know what you're doing, Dan!" Scott shouted, but it was in vain. Jacob stood still, his heart pounding. In that moment, he felt the thin line between life and death. His hand trembled slightly, but his gaze remained steady, locked on Ellis. "You don't have to do this, Dan," Jacob said, his voice surprisingly calm. "We can end this the right way. Don't take it too far." But Ellis's eyes showed no signs of listening. He gripped the gun tightly, as if this was the only way to assert the power he had lost throughout this confrontation. The sound of police sirens grew louder, and the flashing blue and red lights began to reflect off the road. Backup had arrived, but was it fast enough to prevent a tragedy? Scott, still not completely down, made one last desperate plea. "Dan, think about this. This isn't the way to end it. If you shoot him, there's no going back." Ellis stood there, the gun still aimed at Jacob, his eyes filled with chaos. Jacob, even feeling the threat in front of him, remained calm. He knew that one wrong move could end everything in a tragic outcome. Time seemed to slow as the police sirens grew louder, now just seconds away from reaching the scene. Would Ellis continue down the path he had started, or would he realize that things had gone too far? Jacob felt the tension in the air, each second dragging on as if it were an eternity. Ellis, still holding the gun pointed at him, had a look of uncontrollable rage. The headlights of the approaching police cars made the situation even more dangerous, as Jacob knew that when other officers arrived, things could escalate beyond anyone's control. One wrong move, one misstep, and someone would be shot. "Dan, you're not like this," Scott said, his voice softening but still filled with urgency. He remained on the ground after Ellis had shoved him, but Scott's eyes were fixed on his colleague with a glimmer of hope that he could convince Ellis to turn back before it was too late. "We messed up, but you can still stop this before it gets any worse." Ellis panted, his hands shaking as he gripped the gun tightly, his eyes flicking between Scott and Jacob. In that moment, Jacob saw a flicker of hesitation in Ellis's eyes, a small piece of reason still fighting against the blind rage. But was it strong enough to pull Ellis back? "You don't understand, Scott," Ellis said, his voice hoarse, almost choking in his throat. "He thinks he can beat us. Beat me. I can't let that happen." Jacob didn't move, even as he realized the gun was pointed directly at his chest. He knew that with just one pull of the trigger, everything could end. Despite the fear rising in his chest, he couldn't let it take over. His voice remained steady. It was his last hope of stopping Ellis from making an irreversible decision. "Ellis," Jacob said, his voice calm but firm, "you don't have to do this. I know you're angry, but killing me won't change anything. You know that." Ellis stared at Jacob, his eyes still burning with anger, but wavering slightly. The gun hadn't been lowered, but Ellis's hands were no longer as rigid as before. The police sirens were now much closer, the flashing blue and red lights reflecting on all three of them. The tension reached its peak as the other police cars turned onto the street, their headlights lighting up the scene as if it were a stage where life and death hung in the balance. Suddenly, a police car sped up and screeched to a halt, the door flying open, and two officers quickly jumped out, guns already drawn. "Drop it!" one of them yelled, their voice echoing through the air. Ellis jerked around, staring at the newly arrived officers. The chaos in his mind seemed to grow as he realized the situation had turned. His eyes flicked between his colleagues and Jacob, like a trapped animal cornered with no idea what to do next. "Put the gun down, Ellis," one of the new officers shouted, his voice firm and commanding. "You're going too far. Don't do something stupid." Scott, still on the ground, tried to get up and approach Ellis. "Listen to them, Dan, stop. We don't need to push this into a tragedy. Let's end it here." Ellis stood frozen, his eyes wide with turmoil. The gun in his hand was still raised, but it was clear that Ellis was caught between two impossible choices. The newly arrived officers held their position, their guns trained on Ellis, ready to act if he made any sudden move. In that moment, Jacob saw an opportunity. This could be the moment to end everything without anyone else getting hurt. He took a deep breath, his steady voice breaking the tense silence. "Ellis, just put the gun down. Everyone's watching. You don't have to keep going like this." Ellis stared at Jacob, his eyes empty, as if he no longer understood the world around him. "You think you've won, don't you?" Ellis asked, his voice dripping with bitterness. But then, as if all the energy had been drained from him, Ellis let out a long, heavy sigh. The gun in his hand began to lower, slowly. A collective sense of relief washed over the scene, but no one dared let their guard down. Ellis still held the gun, and with just one sudden move, things could turn catastrophic. The officers who had just arrived kept their guns aimed at him, but no one rushed in. Finally, Ellis dropped the gun to the ground. The cold sound of the weapon hitting the pavement echoed in the quiet. Everyone, including Jacob, breathed a sigh of relief. Ellis hung his head, his arms limp at his sides, as if all his strength had left him. Scott quickly moved forward, handcuffing Ellis without saying a word. There were no more justifications, no more rage. Ellis, now only a defeated man, was taken away. Police officers moved in, pulling Ellis up and leading him toward the patrol car, while others began securing the scene. Jacob stood still, his legs feeling frozen, but inside him swirled a storm of emotions: relief, pain, and a simmering anger. Scott approached Jacob, his eyes filled with regret. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, his voice breaking. "I didn't know it would go this far." Jacob looked at Scott, saying nothing. He knew Scott's apology couldn't change what had happened, but at least, in the final moment, Scott had chosen to do the right thing, and that may have saved Jacob's life. The scene around them began to calm. Ellis, now in handcuffs, was led toward the patrol car. His shoulders slumped, as if the weight of regret and failure had crashed down on him, not just for what he had done, but for realizing he had lost everything: his honor, his career, and his pride. Jacob watched Ellis's figure disappear behind the police car door, but there was no complete relief in his heart. Though Ellis had been restrained and backup had arrived, the confrontation would remain seared into Jacob's mind. The shouting, the threats, and the moments of danger when the gun had been pointed at his chest, all of it felt like a mental wound that wouldn't heal easily. Scott stood next to Jacob, looking remorseful but silent. There was nothing left to say. Jacob could feel Scott's guilt, and he also understood that, while Scott had tried to salvage the situation at the end, his initial silence had allowed things to spiral out of control. It was a silence filled with guilt. The other officers began their work, taking statements, documenting the scene, and securing the area. Jacob felt as though he was standing on the edge of a storm that had passed, but it left behind destruction and a torrent of emotions. He had survived, but not without scars. And the wounds weren't just the bruises on his body. They were the mental wounds from facing the injustice he had endured, just because of the color of his skin. An officer approached Jacob, speaking to him with far more courtesy than earlier in the night. "Mr. Carter, we'll need you to come to the station to file a full report. Do you need any assistance?" Jacob shook his head, taking a deep breath before replying, "I'll drive myself, thank you." Though the offer of help seemed genuine, Jacob wanted to hold on to the little bit of independence and dignity he had left. Too much had been taken from him tonight: his freedom, his peace, and his trust in the justice system he had dedicated his life to serving. As Jacob walked toward his car, which had been ransacked, the other officers cast discreet glances his way. They knew this situation wouldn't easily be swept under the rug. Jacob was an FBI agent, and this incident would undoubtedly become the subject of a much larger investigation. Ellis and Scott would face consequences, but that wouldn't be enough to ease the sense of loss and injustice that Jacob had been forced to endure. When Jacob sat behind the wheel, he paused for a moment, his hands shaking slightly as they rested on the steering wheel. Tonight hadn't just been an unexpected ordeal, it had been a harsh reminder of the injustice people like him faced every day, regardless of who they were or what they'd achieved, simply because of the color of their skin. Even as an FBI agent, that hadn't been enough to protect him from the prejudice and discrimination he had been battling his entire life. A few minutes later, Jacob drove away from the scene, the streetlights casting long shadows as his car moved down the road. The darkness of the night was slowly giving way to the faint light of dawn. Inside him, conflicting emotions swirled: anger, pain, but also a sense of relief that he had survived. Jacob's life would never be the same. This confrontation would become a defining moment, a reminder that justice isn't always fair, But he also knew that this fight wasn't over. With the evidence in hand and the support of his colleagues in the FBI, he wouldn't let this incident be buried. Ellis would face justice, and the system he had dedicated his life to serving needed to be changed from within. As Jacob drove through the empty streets, he realized that he wasn't just a victim. He had become a symbol of resilience. This wasn't just his fight, it was the fight of millions of people who had been treated unfairly simply because of their skin color. And Jacob Carter wouldn't stop until true justice was achieved. There was still work to be done. But tonight, despite the pain and the trauma, Jacob had reclaimed the most valuable thing, his right to live, to exist, and to fight for a fairer future. Jacob Carter's story is a powerful testament that no matter who you are, what you do, or what you've achieved, sometimes injustice finds its way into our lives. But the important thing is to never lose faith in justice and to keep fighting for what's right. Jacob faced discrimination, but he didn't give in. He turned his pain into a drive to reform a system that desperately needs change. Through this story, we see a clear message. Everyone has the right to stand up for themselves and their community against injustice. Perseverance and courage will lead us to a fairer future, where everyone, no matter their background or skin color, is treated with respect and justice. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel so we can continue sharing inspiring stories and help drive positive change in society. Together, we can make a difference. Hit the subscribe button so you won't miss any content and join us on the journey toward a better future.